The morning sun cast long shadows across the main street of Millbrook as Margaret Hayes walked toward the general store with her head held high despite the whispers that followed her every step. She had grown accustomed to the way conversation stopped when she entered a room, and how eyes tracked her movements like hawks watching prey. 6 months had passed since her husband Thomas died in the mining accident, leaving her with nothing but debts and a small cottage on the edge of town. Margaret pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she passed the bakery where Mrs. Henderson and her friends stood in their usual morning cluster. Their voices dropped to hushed tones, but Margaret caught fragments of their words carried on the crisp autumn breeze. She knew what they said about her. The widow who couldn't keep her husband safe. The woman who now worked at the saloon serving drinks to make ends meet. The desperate soul who would surely fall into ruin without a man to guide her. She pushed open the door to the general store, and Mr. Peterson behind the counter gave her a curt nod that barely qualified as acknowledgement. Margaret had once been welcomed here with warm smiles when Thomas was alive and they had credit to spend. Now she paid with coins earned from long nights at the saloon, counting every penny twice before parting with it. From his position near the hardware section, Clayton Ross watched the scene unfold with growing irritation. He had ridden into town early that morning to pick up supplies for his ranch, the largest spread in 3 counties. As one of the wealthiest men in the territory, Clayton was used to respect and attention wherever he went. But for the past several weeks, something else had captured his focus entirely. Margaret Hayes. He had first noticed her a month ago when he stopped at the saloon for a whiskey after a long day of cattle drives. She had served him with quiet dignity, her green eyes tired but unbowed. Unlike the other women who worked there, Margaret didn't flirt or simper. She simply did her job with the kind of grace that spoke of better days and harder falls. Clayton found himself returning to town more often than necessary, always finding excuses to visit places where he might catch a glimpse of her. He watched as the townspeople treated her like a pariah, as if misfortune were somehow contagious. He saw how she bore their judgment with silent strength, never complaining or defending herself against their cruel assumptions. Now, as he observed Mr. Peterson's cold treatment of Margaret in the general store, Clayton felt his jaw tighten. He picked up a bag of nails he didn't need and approached the counter just as Margaret was counting out coins for a small bag of flour and some dried beans. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," Clayton said, tipping his hat to her with genuine respect. Margaret looked up in surprise. Few people in town addressed her so formally anymore, and certainly not men of Clayton Ross's standing. "Mr. Ross," she replied with a small nod, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Add Mrs. Hayes's purchases to my account," Clayton told Peterson firmly, cutting off the storekeeper's protest with a sharp look. "And I'll take twice the amount she's buying. Have it delivered to her address." "Sir, I cannot accept," Margaret began, her pride evident in every word. "I pay my own way." Clayton turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious but kind. "Consider it a loan then, if you must. Though in my experience, neighbors should help neighbors without need for repayment. That's how communities are supposed to work." Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she blinked them back quickly. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, the generosity or the simple fact that someone had called her a neighbor, rather than treating her like a burden on the town. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. As Clayton completed his own purchases, he couldn't help but notice how Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she gathered her original small bag of supplies. Something stirred in his chest, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. His own wife had died in childbirth a decade ago, taking their unborn son with her. Since then, Clayton had buried himself in building his ranch empire, keeping relationships at arm's length. But Margaret Hayes was different. There was something about her quiet resilience that called to him. She wasn't looking for rescue or pity. She was simply trying to survive with whatever dignity the town would allow her to keep. Over the following weeks, Clayton found himself orchestrating more encounters with Margaret. He began taking his evening meals at the saloon, always requesting her section. He made sure to speak to her respectfully each time, asking about her day and treating her like the lady she was rather than just another saloon worker. At first, Margaret was guarded, clearly suspicious of his motives. She had learned the hard way that kindness from men often came with unwanted expectations, but Clayton remained consistent. He never made inappropriate advances or suggestions. He simply showed her the respect that the rest of the town refused to give. Gradually, Margaret began to relax in his presence. Their conversations grew longer, moving beyond pleasantries to real discussions about books, about the changing seasons, about life itself. One evening, as Margaret served Clayton his dinner, she lingered a moment longer than usual. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked suddenly, her voice soft but direct. "Everyone else in this town has already decided who and what I am. Why haven't you?" Clayton set down his fork and looked at her thoughtfully. "Because I've learned that tragedy doesn't define a person's character. How they handle that tragedy does. And you, Mrs. Hayes, handle yours with more grace than most people handle their greatest triumphs." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. No one had spoken to her that way in so long. The simple acknowledgement of her struggle, the recognition of her strength, it broke through walls she had carefully constructed around her heart. "I should get back to work," she said. But her voice was warmer than before, and when she looked at Clayton, there was something new in her eyes. Perhaps it was the first tiny seed of trust, or maybe just the recognition that not everyone in Millbrook had written her off as worthless. As Clayton rode back to his ranch that night under a canopy of stars, he realized that his interest in Margaret Hayes had evolved into something deeper than simple attraction or sympathy. He admired her. More than that, he found himself wanting to shield her from the town's cruelty, to give her back the life she deserved. But Clayton was a patient man. He had built his empire through careful planning and measured decisions. Whatever he felt for Margaret, he knew he needed to move slowly. She had been hurt enough. The last thing he wanted was to add to her pain by rushing her or making her feel obligated to him because of his help. So he continued his quiet campaign of respect and kindness, showing up in her life like a steady presence, never demanding anything in return. And slowly, like ice melting under spring sun, he began to see Margaret's walls start to lower, brick by careful brick. Winter arrived in Millbrook with unusual ferocity that year. Snow piled high against storefronts and homes, transforming the dusty frontier town into a landscape of white and gray. For Margaret, the cold brought new challenges. The small cottage she rented had gaps in the walls that let in icy drafts, and her meager earnings at the saloon barely covered food, let alone firewood to keep warm. She woke one particularly bitter morning to find frost coating the inside of her windows. Her breath formed clouds in the air as she pulled on every piece of clothing she owned in layers. The water in her basin had frozen solid overnight. Margaret stared at it for a long moment, fighting back the despair that threatened to overwhelm her. She had survived so much already, but some days the weight of simply existing felt unbearable. She forced herself to move, to prepare for another day of work and judgment. But when she opened her front door to head into town, she stopped short. Stacked neatly on her small porch were several cords of split firewood, enough to last her through the entire winter. A heavy wool blanket lay folded on top, along with a basket containing bread, preserves, salted meat, and other provisions. There was no note, but Margaret didn't need one to know who had left these gifts. Clayton Ross was the only person in Millbrook who showed her such consistent kindness. Her first instinct was to refuse, to load everything onto a cart and return it to his ranch. Her pride screamed that she couldn't keep accepting charity. But as another gust of freezing wind whipped through her threadbare shawl, practicality won out over pride. That evening at the saloon, Margaret waited until Clayton arrived for his dinner. She approached his table with her usual professionalism, but her eyes held questions and emotions she couldn't quite name. "The firewood," she began quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear. "I cannot keep accepting such generosity from you, Mr. Ross. People will talk." Clayton looked up at her with those steady blue eyes that always seemed to see right through her carefully maintained composure. "People are already talking, Mrs. Hayes. They've been talking since the day your husband died. Does their gossip keep you warm at night? Does their judgment feed you?" His words were blunt but not unkind. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or something else, she couldn't say. "I have my pride," she whispered. "Pride is important," Clayton agreed, his voice low and serious. "But survival is more important. There's no shame in accepting help when you need it, especially when it's freely given with no expectations attached." Margaret wanted to argue, but she found she couldn't. The truth was, without Clayton's help, she might not make it through the winter. The saloon owner had already cut her hours, claiming business was slow, though Margaret suspected it had more to do with pressure from the town's more respectable citizens who didn't like seeing her there. As if reading her thoughts, Clayton continued, "I've also heard your hours have been reduced. If you need additional work, my ranch always has need of someone who can handle the household accounts and correspondence. My current manager is good with cattle but terrible with paperwork. Mr. Ross." "I couldn't possibly," Margaret protested, though her heart leaped at the possibility of steady, respectable employment. "Why couldn't you?" Clayton challenged gently. "You're educated, aren't you? Thomas used to mention how you helped him with his business ledgers before the mining company hired him." Margaret was surprised he remembered such details about her late husband. Most people in town seemed to have forgotten Thomas entirely, reducing him to just another casualty of the dangerous mining work that powered the local economy. "I am educated," she admitted. "My father believed daughters should learn the same as sons. I can read, write, and calculate as well as any man." "Then it's settled," Clayton said with the kind of finality that came from years of making decisions and expecting them to be followed. "You'll start next Monday. I'll send a wagon to collect you each morning and return you each evening. The pay will be fair and you'll take your meals at the ranch on working days." "The town will say terrible things," Margaret warned, though she could feel her resistance crumbling. The offer was too good, too necessary for her survival. Clayton's expression hardened slightly. "The town already says terrible things. At least this way you'll have a warm place to work and regular meals, unless you'd prefer to freeze and starve to maintain the good opinion of people who've shown you nothing but cruelty." When he put it that way, Margaret realized how foolish her hesitation seemed. She had been so concerned with what others thought that she had been willing to sacrifice her own well-being. What did she owe these people who had turned their backs on her in her darkest hour? "Monday, then," she agreed and felt something shift inside her, like a door opening to possibilities she had thought closed forever. The following Monday, true to his word, Clayton sent a well-maintained wagon with a kind older driver named Samuel to collect Margaret. The ranch hands she passed on her way to the main house tipped their hats respectfully, clearly taking their cues from their employer's treatment of her. It was such a contrast to the cold shoulders and whispered insults she endured in town that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The ranch house itself was impressive, a sprawling structure of timber and stone that spoke of both wealth and good taste. Clayton met her at the door personally, showing her to a comfortable office with a large desk, proper lighting, and shelves lined with ledgers and correspondence. "Everything related to the ranch business is here," he explained, gesturing to the organized chaos of papers and books. "I need someone to make sense of it all, to create proper systems for tracking expenses and income, to handle correspondence with buyers and sellers. Can you do that?" Margaret surveyed the task before her with the first genuine interest she had felt in months. Here was work that would challenge her mind, that would use skills she had thought lost to her forever. "Yes," she said with growing confidence. "Yes, I can do this." Clayton smiled, and Margaret noticed how it transformed his usually serious face. "I knew you could. There's tea in the kitchen, and Mrs. Chen, my cook, has been instructed to make sure you eat properly. If you need anything, my office is just down the hall." As he turned to leave, Margaret called out, "Mr. Ross, why are you doing this? Really doing this?" Clayton paused in the doorway, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion she hadn't heard from him before. "Because everyone deserves a second chance at life, Mrs. Hayes. And because I've watched you bear more than any person should have to bear alone. Maybe it's time you had someone in your corner." He left before she could respond, but his words echoed in the quiet office. For the first time since Thomas died, Margaret felt something other than grief and desperation. She felt hope. The work proved challenging but satisfying. Margaret threw herself into organizing Clayton's business affairs with dedication that impressed everyone on the ranch. She discovered he was even wealthier than town gossip suggested, with investments and holdings that extended far beyond cattle ranching. Yet despite his fortune, Clayton lived relatively modestly and treated his employees with fairness and respect. As weeks turned into months, Margaret found herself looking forward to her days at the ranch. Not just because of the work, though she took pride in how she had streamlined the business operations, but because of the brief conversations she shared with Clayton, the way he sought her opinion on business matters, how he valued her insights and treated her as an intellectual equal. One snowy afternoon, as Margaret was preparing to leave for the day, Clayton appeared in the office doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might want something warm before heading back to town," he said, setting 1 cup on her desk. "Thank you," Margaret said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "The accounts are nearly balanced for the quarter. You've had an excellent year." "We've had an excellent year," Clayton corrected. "Your organizational skills have saved us considerable money and time." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both staring out the window at the falling snow. Margaret found herself thinking how different her life looked now compared to just a few months ago. She had work she enjoyed, respect she had thought lost forever, and something else she was afraid to name. "The town is still talking," she said quietly. "Mrs. Henderson made sure I knew that people think I've become your mistress." Clayton's jaw tightened. "What people think and what is true are often 2 different things." "I know," Margaret said, "and I find I care less each day what they think. Strange, isn't it? I used to worry so much about reputation and respectability. Now I realize that the people worth impressing are the ones who judge you by your character, not your circumstances." "That's wise," Clayton said, and when Margaret looked up at him, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. There was admiration there, certainly, but also something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken words and possibilities. But then Samuel knocked on the doorframe, announcing that the wagon was ready, and the spell broke. Margaret gathered her things and allowed Clayton to help her into her coat, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on her shoulders. As the wagon carried her back toward town, spring arrived slowly that year, as if winter was reluctant to release its grip on Millbrook. Margaret had worked at Clayton's ranch for nearly 5 months now, and the transformation in her life was remarkable. She had saved enough money to repair her cottage properly, and though she still lived modestly, she no longer went to bed hungry or cold. More importantly, she had regained something she thought lost forever: her sense of purpose and self-worth. The town's attitude toward her had shifted as well, though not in the way she might have hoped. The gossip had intensified rather than diminished. Margaret was no longer just the unfortunate widow. She had become the subject of scandalous speculation. Women clutched their shawls tighter when she passed, and men either leered at her or avoided her gaze entirely. The assumption was clear: a woman working alone for a wealthy bachelor must be providing services beyond bookkeeping. Margaret tried not to let it bother her. She had learned that people who wanted to think poorly of you would find reasons regardless of the truth. But some days the weight of their judgment still pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. One particularly difficult morning, she arrived at the ranch to find Clayton waiting for her in the office, his expression troubled. The moment she saw his face, Margaret's stomach tightened with worry. "Is something wrong?" she asked, removing her bonnet with trembling fingers. Clayton ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "I had visitors yesterday evening, a delegation from town led by Reverend Matthews and Mayor Thompson." Margaret's heart sank. She could imagine exactly what that conversation had been about. "They came to express their concerns about your employment here," Clayton continued, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They suggested that our arrangement was inappropriate and damaging to both our reputations. The Reverend was particularly insistent that I should dismiss you for the good of my immortal soul." Margaret sank into her chair, the familiar shame washing over her. "I understand if you need to let me go. I don't want to cause trouble for you. You've been nothing but kind to me, and I've repaid that kindness by making you the subject of gossip." "Stop," Clayton said firmly, moving to stand before her desk. "You've done nothing wrong, Margaret. Nothing. You've worked hard, improved my business operations significantly, and conducted yourself with complete propriety. I will not dismiss you because small-minded people can't imagine a professional relationship between a man and a woman." It was the first time he had called her by her given name, and the intimacy of it sent a flutter through her chest. She looked up at him, seeing the determination in his eyes, but also something else, something that had been growing between them for months, unspoken but undeniable. "What did you tell them?" she asked quietly. A slow smile spread across Clayton's face. "I told them that my employment practices were none of their concern. I also made it clear that any businessman in town who continued to ostracize you would find his credit suspended at my bank. And I reminded the Reverend that judgment is supposed to be reserved for the Almighty. not for men who should know better. Despite herself, Margaret laughed. It was a sound she hadn't heard from her own lips in so long that it almost surprised her. You didn't. I did, Clayton confirmed, his smile widening. I may have also suggested that if the good citizens of Millbrook had shown you half the Christian charity they claim to value, none of this would have been an issue in the first place. Margaret shook her head, torn between gratitude and concern. You shouldn't make enemies on my account. Clayton. His name slipped out naturally, and she saw his eyes light up at the sound of it. I'm not making enemies, he said, leaning against the edge of her desk in that casual way he had, that always made her heart beat faster. I'm simply clarifying where I stand. And I stand with you, Margaret. I have from the beginning, and I always will. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Margaret found she couldn't look away from his eyes, which held a warmth and intensity that made her breath catch. She knew this moment was dangerous, that they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. Clayton, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we doing? He understood immediately what she was really asking. The question wasn't about work or propriety or what the town thought. It was about the feelings that had been building between them, the connection that grew stronger with every passing day. I think, Clayton said carefully, we're being honest with ourselves for the first time. At least I am, Margaret's breath caught. And what are you being honest about? Clayton reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. His touch was warm and solid, anchoring her in the moment. I'm being honest about the fact that I care for you, Margaret, deeply. I have for months now. I've tried to be patient, to give you time to heal, to not burden you with my feelings when you were still grieving. But after yesterday's visit from those hypocrites, I realized that life is too short and too uncertain to hide how I feel. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief and joy and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. I care for you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now, but I was afraid. Afraid of what people would say, afraid of betraying Thomas's memory, afraid of being hurt again. I can't promise that loving me won't come with challenges, Clayton said honestly. This town has already decided we're guilty of impropriety, but I can promise that I will always respect you, always stand by you, and always treat you as the remarkable woman you are. Loving you? Margaret repeated, her heart soaring at the word even as her practical mind tried to catch up. Clayton squeezed her hand gently. Yes, loving. Because that's what this is, Margaret. I love you. I think I fell in love with you the first time I saw you hold your head high, while the town tried to break you down. Your strength, your grace, your determination to survive with dignity, even when everyone else had written you off. How could I not love you? Margaret felt something break open inside her, all the walls she had built around her heart crumbling at once. I love you too, she said, and saying the words aloud felt like stepping into sunlight after months in shadow. I didn't think I could feel this way again, but I do. You've given me back my life, Clayton. More than that, you've given me back myself. Clayton lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently, a gesture so tender it made Margaret's eyes swim with fresh tears. So what do we do now? He asked. We both know what the town will say if we continue as we are. But I won't ask you to hide what we feel. I'm tired of pretending there's nothing between us. Margaret thought about the Reverend and the Mayor, about Mrs. Henderson and all the others who had judged her so harshly. She thought about Thomas, and the guilt she had carried over surviving when he hadn't. But mostly she thought about Clayton and the future they could have together if she was brave enough to reach for it. Then we stop pretending, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. We stop letting other people's small-mindedness dictate how we live our lives. If they want to talk, let them talk. We'll know the truth, and that will be enough. Clayton's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Are you sure? Once we acknowledge this publicly, there's no going back. You'll be tied to me in the eyes of everyone in Millbrook. I'm sure, Margaret said, and she was. For the first time in over a year, she was absolutely certain about something. But Clayton, I need to be honest with you about something. I love Thomas. I grieve him still in my way. If we move forward together, you need to understand that part of my heart will always belong to him. I would never ask you to forget him, Clayton assured her. Thomas was a good man who loved you well. He deserves to be remembered. There's room in the human heart for many kinds of love, Margaret. The love you had for him doesn't diminish what we can have together. Margaret stood moving around the desk until she was standing directly before Clayton. She reached up and touched his face. Feeling the slight roughness of his jaw beneath her fingertips, he covered her hand with his own, turning his head to press a kiss to her palm. "So we're really doing this?" she asked, half laughing, half crying. "You and me against the gossips of Millbrook?" "You and me," Clayton confirmed. "Though I have to warn you, I'm not planning on a long courtship. I've waited long enough already and I'm not a young man anymore. If you'll have me, Margaret Hayes, I'd like to make you my wife. Soon." Margaret's breath caught at the proposal, unexpected despite everything they had just declared. "That's very sudden," she managed, "is it?" Clayton challenged gently. "We've spent nearly every day together for 5 months. We've talked about everything from philosophy to finances. We've shared meals and conversations and comfortable silences. I know your mind, your heart, your spirit. The only thing that's sudden is saying it out loud." The news of Clayton Ross's intention to marry Margaret Hayes spread through Millbrook like wildfire through dry grass. Within hours of their private declaration to each other, Clayton had made their engagement public by announcing it at the saloon during the busiest hour of the evening. He walked in with Margaret on his arm, her hand resting in the crook of his elbow, and simply stated to the stunned crowd that they would be married within the month. The reaction was exactly what Margaret had expected, yet somehow still shocking in its intensity. The saloon fell silent for a long moment before erupting into chaos. Some men cheered, either genuinely happy or simply drunk enough not to care about propriety. Others muttered darkly about scandal and impropriety. The women present, the working girls who had been Margaret's colleagues, offered her genuine smiles and congratulations, understanding better than anyone what she had endured. But it was the response from the town's respectable citizens that truly revealed the depth of feeling against their union. Within days, a campaign began to pressure Clayton to change his mind. Business associates suddenly became unavailable for meetings. The Reverend preached a sermon on the sanctity of marriage and the dangers of hasty decisions made in the grip of improper passions. Women who had once competed for invitations to Clayton's rare social gatherings now proclaimed they would never set foot in his home if Margaret was its mistress. Margaret watched all of this with a mixture of sadness and resolve. She had known their happiness would come at a cost, but seeing it play out in real time was still painful. One evening, as they sat together in Clayton's study discussing wedding plans, she voiced her concerns. "Are you certain about this?" she asked, setting down the list of potential guests she had been reviewing. "Most of the names would likely decline their invitation. You're sacrificing so much, Clayton. Your position in society, friendships, business relationships, all for me." Clayton looked up from the correspondence he had been reading, his expression serious but untroubled. "I'm not sacrificing anything that matters, Margaret. What good is a position in society if it requires me to reject the woman I love? What kind of friendships are built on judgment and conditional acceptance? As for business, my ranch succeeds because I run it well, not because of social niceties." "But you worked so hard to build all of this," Margaret persisted, gesturing to the comfortable study, the successful ranch beyond the windows. "Everything you've achieved could be threatened because of me." Clayton rose from his desk and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level. He took both her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "Listen to me carefully, Margaret. Everything I've built, I built because I had nothing better to do with my time after my first wife died. I threw myself into business because there was an emptiness in my life that needed filling. But things, possessions, success, none of it filled that emptiness. You do. You make me feel alive again. You make me want to build a future, not just accumulate wealth." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I just don't want you to regret this." "To regret me? Impossible," Clayton said firmly. "The only thing I would regret is letting you go because I was too cowardly to stand against public opinion. The only thing I would regret is waking up years from now, still alone, still empty, wondering what my life could have been if I had been brave enough to choose love." His words dissolved the last of Margaret's doubts. She leaned forward and kissed him, a gentle press of lips that held all the love and gratitude she felt. When they parted, Clayton was smiling. "Besides," he added with a hint of mischief, "I rather enjoy proving people wrong. Let them think I'm ruining myself. In a year, when we're happy and prosperous and they're still bitter and small-minded, we'll see who made the better choice." Margaret laughed, and the sound filled the study with warmth. "You're impossible." "I prefer determined," Clayton countered, rising to his feet and pulling her up with him. Now, shall we continue planning this wedding? Or would you like to discuss how we're going to handle the next wave of social outrage? They decided on a small ceremony at the ranch, attended only by those who genuinely supported their union. It would be intimate rather than grand, meaningful rather than showy. Margaret found she preferred it that way. She had no desire for the elaborate church wedding that town society would expect. Better to celebrate their love surrounded by people who actually cared for them than to stage a performance for those who wished them ill. As the wedding date approached, however, an unexpected ally emerged. Mrs. Chen, Clayton's cook who had been with him since before his first wife's death, took Margaret aside one afternoon. The older woman's face was kind but serious as she led Margaret to the kitchen for tea. "I need to tell you something," Mrs. Chen began, pouring tea into delicate china cups, "about Mr. Clayton and what this marriage means to him." Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. "Of course. What is it?" Mrs. Chen settled into her chair with a sigh. "When his first wife died, Mr. Clayton nearly died with her. Not physically, you understand, but inside. He became a shell of himself, just going through motions without really living. I watched him build this ranch empire, watched him become one of the most successful men in the territory, but I also watched him become lonelier with each passing year." The older woman reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. "Then you came along. I've been here for all of it, watching him find reasons to go into town, watching him light up whenever he talked about you, watching him become himself again. You gave him back his life, Mrs. Hayes. Whatever the town says, whatever challenges you face, you need to know that you've already given him the greatest gift possible." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He saved me too," she whispered. "When everyone else saw only a fallen woman, he saw someone worth respecting, worth loving. That's because Mr. Clayton has always had the ability to see what others miss," Mrs. Chen said with a knowing smile. "He sees value where others see nothing. It's what made him successful in business, and it's what brought him to you. You're both lucky to have found each other." The conversation stayed with Margaret through the final days before the wedding. She realized that their love story wasn't just about two people finding each other. It was about two people who had been lost finding their way back to life itself. They had both survived tragedies that could have destroyed them, and instead of being broken by those experiences, they had been refined by them, made ready to appreciate and nurture the love they had found. The night before the wedding, Margaret stood in her cottage looking at the simple dress she would wear. It wasn't the elaborate gown she had worn when she married Thomas, but it was beautiful in its own right. More importantly, it was honest. It represented who she was now, a woman who had survived loss and judgment and emerged stronger for it. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Samuel, Clayton's driver, standing there with a large box in his arms. "Mr. Ross asked me to deliver this to you, ma'am," Samuel said with a respectful nod. "He said you're not to open it until tomorrow morning, just before the ceremony." Margaret accepted the box with curiosity and gratitude. After Samuel left, she placed it carefully on her small table, wondering what Clayton could have sent. The man was full of surprises, always finding ways to show his love through thoughtful gestures rather than grand pronouncements. Sleep came fitfully that night. Margaret's mind raced with thoughts of the day ahead, of the life she was about to begin. She thought about Thomas, too, sending up a quiet prayer that wherever he was, he understood and approved of her choice to love again. She had loved him truly, and part of her always would, but she also knew that Thomas would have wanted her to find happiness, to find someone who would care for her as he had. When morning came, Margaret bathed and arranged her hair with trembling fingers. The whole cottage seemed filled with anticipation, as if the very walls knew that something momentous was about to occur. Finally, with the sun climbing higher in the sky, she opened Clayton's box. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a beautiful shawl of the finest wool, dyed a soft cream color and embroidered with delicate flowers. But it was the note tucked inside that made Margaret's breath catch. "My dearest Margaret," it read in Clayton's strong handwriting. "When I first saw you walking through town, you wore a threadbare shawl that you pulled tight against the cold and the cruelty of those around you. It broke my heart to see such dignity clothed in such poverty. Today, as you become my wife, I want you to have a shawl that reflects what I see when I look at you: beauty, strength, and grace. Wear this knowing that you will never face the cold alone again. Yours always, Clayton." Margaret pressed the note to her chest, tears streaming down her face. How had she been so fortunate to find such a man? Someone who saw not just who she was, but who she had always been beneath the circumstances that had tried to define her. She wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, and it felt like an embrace, like a promise, like coming home. The wagon arrived precisely on time, driven by Samuel, who helped her aboard with the kind of respect usually reserved for royalty. As they made their way to the ranch, Margaret noticed something unusual. Despite the early hour, people had come out of their homes to watch ours. The first weeks of marriage brought adjustments and challenges that Margaret had anticipated, but Clayton seemed to navigate with surprising ease. Moving into the ranch house permanently meant learning new routines, managing a larger household, and adjusting to life as Mrs. Clayton Ross. But more than these practical matters, it meant facing the consequences of their choice to marry, despite society's disapproval. The town's response was swift and unforgiving. Invitations that had once regularly arrived for Clayton dried up completely. Business associates who had previously sought his counsel now avoided him at social gatherings. The bank where he served on the board suggested he might want to step down to avoid controversy. Even some of his ranch hands, influenced by their wives' opinions or their own prejudices, requested transfers to other properties or simply quit. Margaret watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of guilt, despite Clayton's reassurances. One morning, about 3 weeks after the wedding, she found him in his study reviewing financial documents, his expression more troubled than she had seen since their engagement. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly from the doorway. Clayton looked up and his face immediately softened. "Come in, love. It's nothing we can't handle." Margaret entered and sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "Please don't shield me from the truth. I need to know what our marriage has cost you." Clayton leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully before speaking. "The bank has formally requested my resignation from the board. 3 of my regular cattle buyers have informed me they'll be seeking other suppliers. And yesterday I received word that the Ranchers Association has voted to exclude me from their annual meeting." Each revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had known there would be consequences, but hearing them laid out so starkly made her chest tighten with remorse. "Clayton, this is too much. You're being punished for choosing me." "I'm being punished for choosing love over hypocrisy," Clayton corrected firmly. "And I don't regret it for a moment, Margaret. Not one single moment. But your livelihood, your reputation, everything you've built," Margaret protested, her voice breaking. Clayton rose from his desk and came to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his just as he had done so many times before. "My livelihood is secure. I own the ranch outright and we have investments they can't touch. As for my reputation, what good is a reputation built on conforming to the narrow-minded standards of people who value appearances over character?" "They're isolating you," Margaret whispered, "making you an outcast just like they did to me." "Then we'll be outcast together," Clayton said with a slight smile. "Margaret, look at me. Do I seem unhappy? Do I seem like a man who regrets his choices?" Margaret studied his face, seeing nothing but certainty and love reflected in his eyes. "No," she admitted. "You seem content. But I worry about the future. What if things get worse?" "Then they get worse and we handle it together," Clayton said simply. "I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. Maybe this isolation is exactly what we need to discover what really matters, who our true friends are, what brings genuine happiness versus what society tells us should make us happy." His words resonated with something Margaret had been feeling herself. Despite the social ostracism, despite the loss of invitations and business relationships, she had never been happier. The ranch had become a sanctuary where she could simply be herself without judgment. She had meaningful work managing the household and helping with business matters. Most importantly, she had Clayton, whose love and respect made her feel valued in a way she had never experienced before. "You're right," she said slowly, realization dawning. "I've spent so much time worrying about what we've lost that I haven't fully appreciated what we've gained." "And what have we gained?" Clayton asked, though his smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Freedom," Margaret replied. "The freedom to live authentically, to love openly, to build a life based on our values rather than others' expectations. When you have nothing left to lose in terms of social standing, you discover what truly matters." Clayton's smile widened, and he stood, pulling her up with him into an embrace. Exactly. We've lost the approval of people whose approval was never worth having in the first place. And in return, we've gained something infinitely more valuable: the ability to live with integrity. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chen, who appeared at the study door with an unusually excited expression. Mr. Ross, Mrs. Ross, you have visitors. Several of them. Margaret and Clayton exchanged puzzled looks. They hadn't been expecting anyone, and given the current social climate, unexpected visitors seemed unlikely to bring good news. In the front parlor, they found a surprising gathering. There was Dr. Harrison, the town physician who had always treated Margaret with quiet respect. Mr. Jameson, who owned the lumber mill on the outskirts of town. The Takahashi family, Japanese immigrants who ran a successful produce farm despite facing their own share of prejudice. And to Margaret's astonishment, 3 of the women who worked at the saloon dressed in their best clothes and looking nervous but determined. Dr. Harrison stepped forward as the unofficial spokesman. Mr. and Mrs. Ross, we hope we're not intruding. We've come to offer our support and frankly our apologies. Apologies? Clayton asked, his arm slipping protectively around Margaret's waist. For not speaking up sooner, Dr. Harrison continued. We've watched the town's treatment of Mrs. Ross both before and after your marriage, and we've been cowards. We disapproved of the cruelty but said nothing. We benefited from your business and friendship but didn't defend you when others attacked. We're here to rectify that. One of the saloon workers, a woman named Sarah whom Margaret had worked alongside, spoke up. Mrs. Ross showed us kindness when we needed it. She never looked down on us, never treated us as less than human like so many others do. If the fancy folks of this town want to shun her for marrying above her station as they see it, then they can shun us too. We stand with you. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She had expected to face this battle alone with Clayton. The idea that others were willing to risk their own social standing to support them was overwhelming. We've also discussed taking action, Mr. Jameson added. Those of us who don't subscribe to the town's narrow views about propriety and who's worthy of respect. We're forming our own social group, if you will, a place where people are judged by their character and actions, not by gossip and prejudice. Mrs. Takahashi nodded enthusiastically. We thought we'd start with regular gatherings, dinners perhaps, where we can build community based on mutual respect rather than artificial social hierarchies. We'd be honored if you would join us. Clayton looked at Margaret and she saw in his eyes the same emotion she felt, hope mixed with gratitude. They weren't alone after all. Their stand against hypocrisy had inspired others to examine their own values and find them wanting. We would be honored, Margaret said, her voice steady despite her emotion. More than honored. Thank you all for your courage. Thank you for yours, Dr. Harrison replied. Watching you two refuse to bow to unjust pressure has reminded many of us what integrity looks like. It's easy to go along with the crowd. It takes real strength to stand for what's right when everyone else is against you. As their unexpected guests settled in for tea and conversation, Margaret realized something profound. Their isolation had not been a punishment but a refining fire. It had burned away the superficial relationships and false friendships, leaving only what was genuine and true. And in doing so, it had revealed allies they hadn't known they had and created opportunities for authentic connection. Later that evening, after their guests had left, Margaret and Clayton sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch lands. The sky blazed with orange and purple, painting the world in colors so vivid they almost hurt to look at. Today changed things, Margaret said softly. Didn't it? It did, Clayton agreed, his arm around her shoulders. We're not alone anymore. We have a community, even if it's not the one we expected. Maybe it's better this way, Margaret mused. A community built on shared values rather than shared social class. A group of people who've all faced judgment in one form or another, and decided that kindness matters more than conformity. Much better, Clayton said, pressing a kiss to her temple. You know what I realized today? The town didn't take anything from us that we needed. They took away hollow relationships and forced associations. What they couldn't take, what they can never take, is what we've built together. Our love, our integrity, our purpose. Margaret leaned into his warmth, feeling more secure than she had in weeks. I spent so long being afraid of what people would think, of what they would say. But their opinions don't define me. They never did. Only my actions define me and my choices. And you've chosen well. Clayton said with quiet pride. You've chosen to survive, to persevere, to love Airpass. Some faces were hostile. 2 years had passed since Clayton Ross married Margaret Hayes, and the transformation in both their lives and in Millbrook itself had been nothing short of remarkable. The small group that had gathered in support of their marriage had grown into a thriving community organization that challenged the town's rigid social hierarchies and championed dignity for all residents regardless of their circumstances or past. Margaret stood in the large meeting room they had built onto the ranch house, surveying the gathered crowd with satisfaction. What had started as informal dinner gatherings had evolved into a full community center that provided education, job training, and support for those facing hardship or discrimination. The room was filled with people from every walk of life. Ranch hands sat beside business owners. Former saloon workers studied alongside farmers' daughters. Immigrants learned English from longtime residents who had learned to see past their own prejudices. Quite a turnout today, Clayton said, coming to stand beside her. His hand naturally found the small of her back, a gesture so familiar now that Margaret barely noticed it, though it still filled her with warmth. The literacy program has been especially successful, Margaret replied, watching as Mrs. Takahashi helped a young Mexican laborer sound out words in a children's book. We've had 15 new students this month alone. Your idea, Clayton reminded her, just like the job placement service and the child care cooperative. You've built something extraordinary here, Margaret. She shook her head, smiling. We've built it, together, and it was true. The community center bore both their names and both their efforts. Clayton had provided the resources and the space, but Margaret had provided the vision and the tireless work to make that vision reality. She had transformed from a woman struggling to survive into a force for change, using her own experiences of hardship and judgment to create pathways for others. The town's elite had watched these developments with growing unease. Their attempts to isolate and punish the Rosses had backfired spectacularly. Instead of breaking them, the social ostracism had freed them to build something that challenged the very foundations of Millbrook's hierarchical society. People who had once accepted their place at the bottom of the social ladder were now learning skills, gaining confidence, and demanding respect. But change, Margaret had learned, never came without resistance. That evening, as she and Clayton were reviewing plans for expanding the center's programs, Samuel appeared at the study door with a worried expression. Mr. Ross, Mrs. Ross, there's a delegation here to see you. Mayor Thompson, Reverend Matthews, and several others from the town council. Margaret and Clayton exchanged knowing looks. They had been expecting this confrontation for months. Show them in, Clayton said calmly, though his hand found Margaret's and squeezed reassuringly. The delegation that entered the study bore little resemblance to the confident, judgmental group that had visited 2 years earlier. Mayor Thompson looked uncomfortable, constantly adjusting his collar. Reverend Matthews kept his eyes downcast, seemingly unable to meet Margaret's gaze. The other council members shifted nervously, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Mr. Ross, Mrs. Ross, the mayor began, his voice lacking its usual authority. We've come to discuss the community center and its impact on Millbrook. Have you? Clayton replied coolly. Please elaborate. The mayor cleared his throat. There are concerns about the center's influence, the way it's changing established social structures. People are getting ideas above their station, questioning traditions that have served this town for generations. You mean people are realizing they deserve respect and opportunity regardless of where they started in life? Margaret interjected, her voice calm but firm. They're learning that their worth isn't determined by birth or circumstances, but by their character and efforts. Reverend Matthews finally looked up, and Margaret was surprised to see something like shame in his eyes. Mrs. Ross, we may have been hasty in our judgment of you. Of both of you. The work you're doing is admirable, but surely you can understand our concern about rapid social change. What I understand, Margaret said, rising from her chair to face them directly, is that you're afraid that if people like me can rise above their circumstances, if immigrants can succeed, if women who work in saloons can learn to read and find better employment, then the power structure that benefits you will crumble. That's not fair, one of the council members protested weakly. Isn't it? Clayton stood beside Margaret, presenting a united front. For 2 years, you've tried to destroy us socially and economically. You've spread rumors, pressured our business associates, attempted to isolate us completely. Yet here we stand, more successful than ever, having built something that serves this community far better than your exclusive social clubs and judgmental committees ever did. The room fell silent. The delegation members looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable with this confrontation. Finally, Mayor Thompson spoke again, his voice subdued. "What do you want from us?" Margaret considered the question carefully. What did she want? Revenge would be easy and perhaps justified. She could demand apologies, humiliate them as they had tried to humiliate her. But looking at these men, seeing their discomfort and growing awareness of their own failings, she realized that wasn't what she wanted at all. "I want you to do better," she said simply. "I want you to recognize that every person in this town has value, regardless of their past or their position. I want you to support programs that help people rather than keeping them in their place. I want you to judge people by who they are, not by what happened to them." "And if we can't promise that?" Reverend Matthews asked quietly. "Then stay out of our way," Clayton replied. "We'll continue building our community with or without your approval. But we'd prefer to work together, to make Millbrook a place where everyone has opportunity, where judgment is replaced with compassion, where past mistakes don't define future possibilities." The delegation left shortly after, promising to consider what had been discussed. Margaret doubted they would change overnight, but seeds had been planted. More importantly, she and Clayton had made clear that they would not be intimidated or deterred from their work. As autumn turned to winter once again, Margaret found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She thought of the terrified widow who had walked through town head held high despite the whispers. She thought of the desperate woman serving drinks at the saloon, trying to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. She thought of the moment Clayton Ross had first shown her kindness and how that single act had changed everything. One snowy evening, Margaret sat by the fire in their bedroom, watching the flames dance. Clayton joined her, handing her a cup of hot tea before settling into the chair beside hers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Choosing me over the life you had before?" Clayton was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "The life I had before was comfortable but empty. I was respected but lonely. I had everything society says a man should want, yet I woke up each day wondering what the point of it all was. Then I saw you, refusing to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed most people. I saw strength and dignity and grace under pressure. How could I not love that? How could I not want that in my life?" "I was so afraid," Margaret admitted. "Afraid of what people would say. Afraid of betraying Thomas's memory. Afraid of being hurt again. But loving you taught me that fear is a poor compass for living. Sometimes the right choice is the scary one." "And are you happy?" Clayton asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Margaret looked around their bedroom, thought about the community center thriving with purpose, remembered the faces of people they had helped find new paths in life. Most of all, she looked at Clayton, this remarkable man who had seen value in her when no one else could. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. "We've built something real here, Clayton. Not just a marriage, but a legacy. A community where people are valued for who they are, not judged for where they've been. Our children will grow up in that community," Clayton said, his hand moving to rest on Margaret's still flat stomach. Margaret's breath caught. They had only just confirmed her pregnancy days ago, and the joy of it still felt fresh and overwhelming. "They will," she agreed, her hand covering his. "They'll grow up knowing that love and integrity matter more than social standing, that kindness is strength, not weakness, that second chances aren't just possible but necessary." As they sat together watching the fire, Margaret thought about how far she had come. From widow to outcast to wife to community leader, her journey had been painful but purposeful. Every hardship had taught her something. Every judgment had strengthened her resolve. Every moment of despair had made her eventual triumph sweeter. The town of Millbrook was changing, slowly but surely. The rigid social,